We want to continue in our series, Walking Through the Bible, and to introduce each book of the Bible. Tonight we'll look at the book of Exodus. Exodus is a going out. It's in the word itself. You see the word exit almost. It's known in our English translations as Exodus after the principal event, obviously, that's related in the book. The departure of the Israelites from the land of bondage, from Egyptian bondage in particular. It is, the Jews typically have identified it. So in the Hebrew Bible, the first, it's typically named after those first couple of words. And literally, these are the words, are those first words in Exodus chapter 1. And so that's typically how the Hebrews would have referenced it. We refer to it obviously as Exodus, and so they would have looked at that and just simply said, these are the words, or Shemoth, which is the names. And you may notice that as well. As you start to read the first couple of verses, these are the names, these are the words, depending on which translation you're looking at. The names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. And it says, each man and his household came with Jacob, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already, and Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. And so, of course, we know Joseph, the end of, from chapters 37 through 50, we read about Joseph in the book of Genesis, and we mentioned that last time. I think it was maybe 3 weeks ago, on a Sunday night that we talked about Genesis. But in so doing, we mentioned Joseph. We mentioned that that last portion, a huge portion of the book of Genesis, is dealing with Joseph and his time in Egypt, being sold into slavery and so forth, and him continuing to rise up, God using him. We see the providential care of God in his life. We see how God prospers him in the hands of whoever he might be subject to at that point in time. He's given the land of Goshen, and there as well he prospers, and so his family will ultimately have that land. But they will, as we read here, increase abundantly. They were fruitful and increased abundantly, according to verse 6, and they multiply and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. And so this is about that family that we are obviously studying at this point in time. When you think about Exodus and you look at commentaries, I just want to note a couple. Adam Clark, who's a great, a Bible commentator. He is denominational in his background, or was denominational in his background. But as far as especially Old Testament history goes and commentary, he really did a great job in this commentary set. And he says, though this book is a continuation of the book of Genesis, and he says, with which it probably was in former times conjoined together, Moses thought it necessary to introduce it with the account of the names and the number of the family of Jacob when they came to Egypt, to show ultimately the point that we've just made there from verse 6, that they're going to grow into an exceedingly great nation, ultimately. And so that promise to Abraham then has been fulfilled. And so Clark points out that as well. Frank Dunn, I wish I could remember the name of his book. Off the top of my head, I can't remember it right this second. Brother Frank Dunn wrote a book, and he introduces each book of the Bible and has quite a synopsis and outlines of each book and so forth. This was his comment pertaining to especially Genesis 15, but he says the book of Exodus is the world's greatest epic of deliverance, the story of the most remarkable people in all history, The aim is to give the first stage of the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, God's covenant with him, that in the fourth generation God would give to his descendants all of the land of Canaan. And so that first being mentioned in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, that first part of that chapter, recounted again to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, Genesis 18, Genesis 22, chapter 26, and again in 28, eventually to Jacob. And so we can see that promise being reiterated over and over. In Exodus, we begin to see the first stage, Brother Dunn says, of that fulfillment of that promise. So we look at Exodus. It is literally an exiting, if you will. They are being delivered from Egyptian bondage. So we ask some questions to try to get us kind of a baseline introduction. And we talked about that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, were written by Moses. The Hebrews referred to this as Torah or law. And so you have typically the law of Moses, which typically we refer to kind of those first 5 books. Moses literally means being one drawn from water. Let's notice a couple of these verses together. I'll have them up on the screen. Exodus 17 and verse 14. The Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua." Joshua would be the one who would take over and lead the people of Israel after Moses. And so Joshua would be Moses' successor in leading the children of Israel. And so he says, write these things as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua. It also kind of lends some credence to the idea that these were probably together, or at least as scrolls would have been, they would have been kept together and eventually would have been separated out. But we see a couple other verses here. Exodus 24, verse 4. Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning, built an altar at the foot of the mountain, 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we see Moses in the writing process, writing these things down. 34:27, Exodus. The Lord said to Moses, "Write these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." And so this again he's told by the Lord, write these things down. Jehovah says, write these things. They are a covenant with me and you, and a covenant with this people, with Israel. Mark 12 and verse 26. As for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses? And Jesus asked this question. In the passage about the bush. What bush? A burning bush, right? When Moses was called by God to go and go back to Egypt, bring his people out of there. And so he says, have you not read in the book of Moses? And so you have a reference to that. And he's specifically talking about this book, the book of Exodus here. In the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And so, again, we ask a couple more questions. Well, when was it written? And you'll find similar answers to these first 5 books, obviously, because they are written by Moses, written about the same time frame. And but here's what I think is interesting. It kind of messed up just a little bit, and so the black part went up into the brown. You might not be able to see it, but it says, written during the last 40 years of Moses' life. Moses' life can be broken down into 3 40-year sections. 40 years when he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. 40 years after he had killed that Egyptian taskmaster. He fled to the land of Midian. He meets his wife and his father-in-law Jethro, and he works for him. And so he is in the land of Midian for another 40 years. That's where then God calls him from that burning bush. And then 40 years he is leading the children of Israel. He'll lead them out of Egypt, lead them toward Canaan, but they won't make it all the way to Canaan yet. And so they'll wander in the wilderness for those next 40 years. And so this is approximately 1450 BC, the time frame of the events and the writing of this. And 1 Kings chapter 6 lends some credence to that idea. in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month. He began to build the house of the Lord. So we have a reference in 1 Kings talking about Solomon, but he references 480 years after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. And so it's pretty easy then, because we have an idea. Solomon reigned from 974 to 934 BC. And so we find that time frame. We're able to kind of mark down some of the things from 1 Kings 11, 42, and so on. He began construction, it says, in his 4th year of his reign. And then the Bible tells us that was 480 years after the people came out of the land of Egypt. And so we're able to mark that date and have a pretty good idea that that's approximately 1450 BC. The book was evidently written in this period, this last 40-year period of Moses' life. We talked about those 3 periods of his life. And so this is the last, when they're wandering in the wilderness. And so from the time of Mount Sinai, after they've come across the Red Sea and out of Egypt, from that time forward in the wilderness wanderings, that's when he is writing those books, the Pentateuch, or the Torah, those 5 books, including Exodus. It is likely, just as a reference, that the Exodus occurred while Amenhotep, that's Pharaoh, that's Amenhotep the second, and was on the Egyptian throne. He ruled from approximately 1450 to 1420 BC. And so if that's correct, then Thutmose III would be the great oppressor that came along that did not know Israel. And so he would be the one who would command the slaughter of their male infants and so forth, and the one that obviously then that they would be rescued from during that time. To whom was it written? We have mentioned, because of Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3, that those who are alive this day, when Moses says it was not written to our fathers, but written to us who are alive this day, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 to 3. And then again, it is recounted as such in Joshua chapter 1, verse 8, verse 13, that this is written to Israel. It gives them a great history, and we're going to talk about next then why exactly that was. And I apologize, I'm not sure why it's so out of order. Things are not the way that they should be up there. But anyway, hopefully we'll be able to get through it all. So why was it written? And I mentioned that it tells obviously a history of Israel. And so God says, you write this down as a memorial, right? So that they would remember. And so that's obviously part of the purpose. This is why it was to be written down. Write this as a memorial. By the way, and you go back to some of those other verses, I think it was in Exodus 34. In that passage, it talked about that God had said to Moses, you write these things down because this is a covenant between me and you and between me and Israel. And so, but what it does, it's a memorial of those things. What is it telling? It's telling about a birth of a nation, right? God is building a great nation, and He's done so through the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And so He's using Joshua providentially to care for His people in the land of Egypt. And even though they're going to do so and grow as this great nation, they're going to suffer some things. They're going to be under great bondage and persecution. They're going to have heavy tasks and burdens placed upon them. But ultimately, so this is going to tell the story of God bringing them out of that. But you have to realize that for God to have brought them out of something, for God to have built this nation, He had to have a location to do that. He had to have a place to do that. And when you start looking at the providence of God, and when you start looking at God's plan, how all of this unfolded, it's quite amazing to see how God cared for His people, protected them, took care of them. And yes, they would suffer some things, obviously, at the hands of the Egyptians later on. But God is still caring for His people. Here's their cries for deliverance. And He will send Moses, that deliverer, to bring them out of Egypt. It tells of their laws. Obviously, in Exodus, we are introduced to the Ten Commandments. There are other laws that are going to obviously be added as part of, or to that as part of the law, especially when we get to Leviticus next and start studying it. And so it tells about their laws. It tells about their government. You think about a people who have been enslaved in Egypt. They have seen the Egyptians. They have grown up under their rule and under their law in this several generations, at least at this point, when it has gotten that 30 years or so, by the time that the next Pharaoh comes on the scene and does not know them and is worried because they're outnumbered and they might join in with our enemies. We looked at those verses this morning in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 and following. And so they set taskmasters over them. But they were given laws. They needed some guidance. They needed to know how God wanted them to proceed, how God wanted them to act, to live, and to be governed. And so they had to have some boundaries and some laws that were laid out for them. And so we see that beginning, obviously, with the Ten Commandments and going forward with the rest of the law of Moses. And so again, it gives them some guidance. It gives them some boundaries, that which they've never had. They are a brand new nation of people. And they need to know God, and they need to know His ways. And so the law does just that. And so it tells of their laws and how they're going to, even their civil laws are surrounding and intertwined amongst the religious rights and laws that they have. It's so intertwined within the law of Moses. It also shows how the chosen nation obviously developed, not just the birth of the nation, but how it developed, where it began, and how it came to be. And it's interesting because Jesus Himself will refer back to those things. Other prophets will talk about, the psalmist will mention, even Moses would write a psalm. Psalm 90 is by Moses. And so all of that to say this, when you think about why it was written, it's going to come a point in time they're going to have to remember these things. Not just the ones who were just living it right then, but what about the next generation and the next generation? And what about 100 years from now? And so on. And so these things needed to be written for a memorial about this covenant between them and God, and with Moses and God as well. And so the book of Exodus covers a history from of Moses obviously bringing them out all the way to the point that really to Joseph, as far as this whole point in time, that first year of wandering. And so you have a sequel, if you will. You could look at it that way, a sequel to Genesis, because even as Adam Clark pointed out, this is a continuation. Let's look at some key verses. Some key verses, key words, and a key phrase. I think these are important for us to pick up on in this as well. Let's look these up together. I won't put these up on the screen. Exodus 3 and verse 8. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Matthew's probably glad I didn't give him that passage to read. That's the land that God was giving to Israel. He said it is a large land. It is a land that flows with milk and honey, and it is a good land. And so He didn't just bring them out to throw them off in the desert somewhere, drop them off, but that's what they would begin to murmur about a little bit later, right? And when we get to the wilderness wanderings. And so they would say, you brought us out of this, you brought us out of Egypt even across the sea, and now we're in this place, and we're just going to perish right here. That makes no sense. And so there was some murmuring, obviously, that would take place and characterize the children of Israel throughout this time. Notice verse 14 through 16. And this has to do with Moses. In fact, I think I spoke on the excuses of Moses, or a sermon similar to that. Moses said to God in verse 13, "Indeed, when I am come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, they say to me, well, what's his name? Well, what shall I say?" And so he hits God with several things. He says, "I'm not an eloquent man." He says, "Okay, I'll send Aaron with you. I can't do this work. I'm going to be with you to do this." Well, what am I supposed to say? Well, this is what you're going to say. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus shall you say to the children of Israel, I am sent me to you." Moreover, God said to Moses, "Thus shall you say to the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my memorial to all generations." And so these are, again, key verses and kind of picking up some key events and things like that in the book. You have chapter 6, verse 2 through 8. Chapter 6. God spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but my name, Lord, I was not known to them. I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, in which they were strangers. I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage. I have remembered my covenant." And he says, "Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, with great judgments. And I will take you as my people and will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brings you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I will give it to you as a heritage. I am the Lord." And so in this passage you have that reiterated then to the children of Israel. God says, this is my people. I'm giving them this land. And this is directly connected to the promise that I made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that which has been reiterated over and over. And then we'll jump over to chapter 12. Exodus 12, verse 23. "For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. When he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you." This is part, obviously, of the Passover, that the destroyer would pass over and not take their firstborn. But many, obviously, of the Egyptians would lose their firstborn. And so this was obviously the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. So we look and we see a couple of things. You see the connection that is made in these key verses to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that promise that was made, that he was going to deliver his people. He had a land that was prepared for them, a land that was large and was good, flowed with milk and honey. Not only that, it was going to take some plagues to ultimately convince, if you will, we'll use that word, to convince Pharaoh to finally let his people go. Of course, we know that he changed his mind, gave chase, and died as a result of so doing. But we see then the Passover of the destroyer over those houses which were prepared for the destroyer. Some key words, obviously, we're talking about deliverance from the Egyptian bondage, and there are ways that we can look at that and see the redemption of God for His people. And then that phrase, 9 times, let my people go. Let my people go. Here's another verse, Exodus 19, verses 4 through 6. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. And think about that for just a moment. That should sound somewhat familiar to us as Christians. Because isn't that what he says? As Christians, we are a kingdom. We are a kingdom. We are a royal priesthood, Peter says. John wrote in Revelation chapter 1, and talked about the fact that we were a kingdom, that we would serve as kings because we were part of that kingdom. And so you have that passage as well. And that's what he's talking about here. That's how he saw his people. You are a special possession to me. Now, I think this is beautiful when you start to think about what Moses is writing down for the children of Israel at this point in time. Consider this. You think about they have been in bondage for generations now. And obviously, in that last generation, it has just only gotten worse for them. And they're crying out for redemption. They're crying out for a deliverance. And God says, I have heard you, and I'm sending Moses to you. Aaron's going to go with him, and he's going to bring you. He's going to be the spokesman, and he's going to bring you out. But what does he say here? I bore you on eagle's wings. The imagery that's used there. I'm the one that lifted you up from that bondage and took you out of that place and gave you a land, a good land, a large land, a land that flowed with milk and honey. Yes, it was the land of the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Perizzites and the Amorites and all of those ites, folks. But it was a good land, and it was prepared for them. It was going to be given to them. It was their possession. But God says, you are my special possession. I want you to think about that, because the way our world today views the Jews and that area as being the Holy Land, right? That's what it's typically referred to as. Yes, it was a land that God had chosen for them. But he says, you are my special possession. You see God's relationship with His people, whether it be under the law of Moses, whether it be as a birth of a nation to begin with, or whether it be a spiritual birth of the kingdom, the church, the body of Christ. He says, you are a special people, a peculiar people to me. I just think that's beautiful. And I think we need to be reminded of that. And I think as we're teaching people about the kingdom, that's something that we can show them, and across the old part of the Bible and the new part of the Bible, if you will, how God's people were viewed by Him. You're my special people. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you are my treasure. You are my treasure, he says, among all people. The whole earth, he says, is mine, but you're my people. I just think that's beautiful and something we need to be reminded of regularly. There are 3 major divisions that we find in the book of Exodus, kind of breaking it down by chapters. And so you see a little bit of an outline here. Chapter 1 through chapter 12, verse 36, you have Israel in Egypt. You have the bondage. You have Moses, the deliverer. You have the 10 plagues through those chapters. The next section is broken down, chapter 12, verse 37, all the way to chapter 18, 27, the end of that chapter. Israel, that's their journey to toward Mount Sinai. Obviously, they're going to pass through the Red Sea on dry ground. And so you have that, the Red Sea to Mount Sinai, part of that trip as well. So you have their departure. And you have that whole conversation. And part of this that I'm reminded of is the fact that Moses, as these plagues are coming upon the Pharaoh and Egypt, you have the Egyptian people. You know they have to be crying out as well, right? Why is this happening to us? What is this all about? Probably to the point that they're probably saying, hey, if it's all about those people, get them out of here. If that gives us some peace, right? But Pharaoh wouldn't have anything to do with it. In fact, Pharaoh's going to argue with Moses. Moses saying, no, we're going to go and we're going to take all of our belongings and we're going to take all of our family and our little ones as well. And what does he try to do? He says, well, you can go and maybe even you can take Aaron. Y'all can go and you can worship on behalf of the people. No, that's not good enough. We're all going to go and we're all going to worship. We're not going to leave anybody behind. Okay, you can go and you can take the people with you. You leave your possessions behind, because he knew they'd have to come back. They'd want their possessions, right? No, we're taking all of our stuff with us, because we have to offer unto God from what we have. And so we're not leaving anything behind, because it all belongs to God. They already had that mindset. At least Moses did, as he's leading the people of Israel out. And so I'm reminded of that over and over. He wants them to stay behind, or leave a little bit behind. Leave a toe in Egypt, if you will, so I have something to hang on to. I can keep you. You can leave how about your children? Some of you probably watching the news this past week saw the San Francisco Gay Choir as they were singing a song that they had posted. And they put it out, and it was, we're going to get your children. We're coming for your children. That was the crux of the song. Oh, they made it all cutesy and fun to listen to and everything. Their agenda hasn't changed. Since that movement started, the agenda has always been to get our children. They're just now finally admitting it and singing jingles about it, okay? Now, that's the sad thing about it. That's what they're attempting to do. This is what Pharaoh was attempting to do. You can go, the adults can go, leave the children behind. We'll keep them. No, we're taking everybody. We're not leaving anyone behind. And so there's certainly a great lesson in that as well. Chapters 19 to 40, this is Israel out at Mount Sinai. They're before the mountain. And chapter 20, they're going to get the Ten Commandments. Moses is up on the mountain meeting with God, getting those commandments written on stone by the very finger of God. He's going to come back and see that they've lost their mind, essentially. You know what they're doing, though? They're doing exactly what they have seen their whole lifetime. They've seen all of this in Egypt. We've got to make some kind of visual things so that we can worship. Let's make the golden calf. Let's do this. Then we'll have something to worship, in fact, and that will be our God. And they talked Aaron into doing that while Moses was up on the mount receiving the commandments. And so not only did he receive those commandments, he received commandments concerning the tabernacle. And this is where God would commune with them and fellowship with them, and how he would in fact lead them and instruct them and all of those things. And so you had plans, specific pattern, in fact. The word pattern is used over and over, talking about what God had instructed, a certain pattern, a rule. This is how I want it marked off, exactly. This is what I want the wood to be that's going to be used. This is where everybody's going to camp around the tabernacle as well. All of those things were part of a pattern that Moses received directly from God while he was communing with him on the mountain at Mount Sinai. And so you have these chapters in the major breakdown. This is how I like to end each section, looking at each book and seeing Christ in each of these books as we're studying them. And very simply, Christ is our Passover. If we want to see Christ in each book, we're going to have to look and see how God's plan has unfolded. What we see, and that's why we mention that passage earlier as we began to look at the destroyer who was going to pass over those houses where the blood was on the doorpost and on the lintel. And as so, you have that Passover. Of course, he's going to actually institute a Passover feast that's going to fall a little bit later. But the Apostle Paul makes the statement that Christ, in fact, indeed, is our Passover. He was the one sacrificed for us. It was as if His blood was placed on the doorpost and on the lintel above the door. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. And so, as you study the book, I hope this will whet your appetite for some study. There are numerous charts that you might find, and I'm sure I have two Bibles up here with me. I have an AP Study Bible, the Defending the Faith Study Bible by Apologetics Press that's put out, and they have a great introduction as well. I love the charts that are in the old Dixon Bibles, and so if anybody knows what I'm talking about when I talk about Dixon Bible, you'll have, typically they were King James versions, but they had the ASV 1901 in brackets right there within the verse, and so you could, it was an analytical study Bible is what it was called, and you could see those verses and compare them directly as along as you were reading them. You could see any differences among those verses. But what they did, they had some great material, introductory type material. Some of that I've used even what I've presented tonight. But there's some great charts that lay out the book. But if you have a good study Bible, then you're liable to have some good helps as well in the front of your Bibles and be able to study along with that. And just something to help you kind of outline those chapters so that you know kind of what's going on, what to look for as you're going through that. As we think about Christ as our sacrifice, what He has done for us, making it possible that we might have salvation, making it possible that we could be delivered from the plague of sin, making it possible that we could have our sins washed away by the blood of Jesus. So He is indeed that sacrifice. He is our Passover. Not just ours. I love the way John words it by inspiration, not for us only, but for all those, for the whole world, in fact. He's not the propitiation, the payment price. He's not just my Passover. He's the Passover for the whole world. And that's good news, because that means that the world can be saved, can be delivered from sin. And that's a message that has to be rung out throughout the world. Mark 16 and verse 15. And Brother Jim reminded us of that very well this morning. If you have a need to respond, to obey the gospel, or to be right with God, to ask for prayers of encouragement or help or strength, then we're here to do just that. So if we can help you, come forward while we stand, while we sing.